Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn Spotlight session. I'm Sharon Gaynor, Training and Research Assistant with Haven Horizons and Knowledge Broker on the Community of Practice. We're delighted to have Shane White with us today. Shane is the Senior Investigating Officer in Fiosrú, formerly known as GSOC, and he'll be discussing his work. But just before I introduce Shane, Haven Horizons would like to extend a big welcome to all new members and those who may be joining the Lunch and Learn for the first time. We hope you find the platform beneficial and conducive to keeping up to date with any progress around domestic, sexual and gender-based abuse and for making connections. Now, Shane has been a Senior Investigating Officer with GSOC, now Fiosrú, since 2017. And in that time, he's led a team responsible for investigating complaints from the public against Gardaí and responding to critical incidents such as deaths in custody and fatal road traffic collisions, where there was some prior interaction with Gardaí. Shane has completed the Garda Senior Investigating Officer, the SIO course at the Garda College, and has qualifications in serious crime investigation, white-collar crime, conflict and dispute resolution, and he recently completed the THUS course reflecting on and responding to the domestic abuse and coercive control, which is delivered by Madeleine McAleer from Haven Horizons. In September 2024, Shane took up the position of SIO in charge of the Specialist Services Unit of Fiosrú, with the aim of professionalising the investigation of complaints from and the response to victims of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. The unit also manages the allocation of specialist interviewers to obtain video recorded accounts from children and vulnerable adults. So I'll pass you over to Shane now.
That's great. Thanks very much, Sharon. So it's good to be here. Long-time listener, first-time caller, if you like. So today I just want to talk about Fiosrú and the Specialist Services Unit. And the work that we're doing and aiming to be part of the community in Ireland, tackling gender and sexual-based violence. I'll just point out my colleague Maria has joined us today as well, so for some moral support for me and to keep me on track in case I drift off. So look, most people would have heard of GSOC. And we recently transitioned to Fiosrú, so the Office of the Police Ombudsman. So that was quite recent, only on the 2nd of April when the Policing Security and Community Safety Act was commenced by the Minister. So there was a number of false starts, kind of well over a year, but you had an election in the middle of that as well. So we have the new legislation now. So we're Fiosrú. I would have thought perhaps there would have been a bit more of a profile in terms of media around the transition, but there's a lot of aspects to the Act. We're only a small part of it. So hopefully, though, people are aware of the change and the new name of the organisation. There are some changes in process in terms of the way that we do our investigations, but fundamentally, the investigations are carried out the same way. As I say, it's just a bit of process in a few areas that have been amended by the new legislation. So before the legislation was introduced, kind of going back to around 2022 even, a consultancy was brought in to look at the way that GSOC did its work, its processes, how it was structured and its staffing and skills and training. And that was in anticipation of the new legislation coming in. So one of the recommendations that came out of that was aiming to improve our independence. Now, we're always an independent organisation in the way we conducted our work, but it was somewhat qualified in that there were some skills that we didn't have within our organisation that we needed to rely on that were in Garda Síochána. So we're looking at crime scene examination, forensic collision investigation, and specialist interviewing. So, as I say, one of the recommendations was to try and increase independence generally. And so two sections have been raised within the organisation now with that aim in mind. One is the Specialist Services Unit and the other is the Digital Forensics Unit. So Digital forensics, I think, is probably a little bit easier to get up and running. You can buy some hardware and some software, and you can train people to download phones, and away they go. So there's very little interaction in terms of dealing with victims and suspects. The Specialist Services Unit, looking at domestic and sexual violence, and I think we'd all know dealing with victims is a lot more nuanced. It's a particular type of investigation, and investigators really need to be aware of where the victim's at and allow the investigation to be victim-led so that they're in the right place for what's happening with the investigation. So we're very conscious of that, and that's what we're aiming to work towards, is improving our response to victims. So at the moment, so I'm the SIO of the Specialist Services Unit. Maria is the investigator. We had one other investigator who's recently left. So at the moment, it's just the two of us, with the aim of building the unit up and developing their skills in this area. We're also responsible for tasking investigators who are trained in achieve best evidence interviewing. So the recorded interviews, probably better known as specialist interviewers. So we have 7 staff who are trained to do that. They carry their own caseloads across investigations, and then I will task them to support other investigators who may require their skills with their particular cases. So what does the unit do? Well, in terms of investigating, there are 2 main types of investigations that we do. One that relates to criminal allegations, and the other is probably better known as a discipline investigation. So in a criminal complaint, it's likely to be the partner or a family member of a Garda member, and it'll concern allegations of domestic or sexual abuse or coercive control. Okay, so against a Garda member, that's our remit. In terms of the discipline investigations, a person in the community may have made a complaint to the guards in relation to their own partner or their own circumstances that they've experienced. And what they've found is that they haven't gotten the response that they were expecting. Perhaps the investigation has been very slow, or they don't actually know what's going on. And so therefore they would make a complaint to us, and we would look at how that investigation was conducted by the guards. So not into the actual offences themselves, but the Garda investigation. And we can measure that against, there's a new policy now, the Domestic Abuse Intervention Policy, and then their evaluation tool. It may have been a breach around the Victims of Crime Act and the responsibilities there. And there's also a greater awareness now of abuse of power for sexual gain. So we will measure the Garda performance against their own policy and the expectations there, and then we can make a recommendation to the Commissioner about whether we believe or not there has been a breach. But ultimately, any decision around that is up to the Garda Commissioner. And in relation to the criminal investigations, the adjudicator is the DPP in relation to that. And then in terms of specialist interviewers, so they will assist investigators in their cases where the victim may be vulnerable, or maybe a young person, where they meet the criteria for having their complaint video recorded, and that would be their evidence in chief if it was to go to trial. So as I said, there were 7 trained. It was training delivered by the PSNI, which was very good. And then after 12 months, we came back, we did 3 days of refresher training. So that allowed those people to review the work that the interviews that they'd done, sort of clarify issues of doubt that they might have had, and then just to sort of undertake practice, if you like, just to develop their confidence to go forward. Because doing those interviews, it's all recorded, they're very exposed, and if you don't do it often, it's something that just is potentially start to have self-doubts about. So we undertook that refresher training just to make sure that the skills are up where they needed to be, because it's a particularly important role. So the benefits of raising this unit and trying to develop these skills, as I said, it's the increase in independence, because what we had were circumstances where, for example, if young people were needed to be interviewed, generally, and it was their parents that were providing the consent for that. I mean, a lot agreed, but the expectation was that if you came to Fiosrú and made a complaint, that you wouldn't then be sent back to the guards for your child to be interviewed. So sometimes that surprised people. Most of the time, the parents obliged, but and occasionally they didn't, and they weren't happy with that particular arrangement. So, sorry, I lost my spot here. So that provided that level of independence, and I would say that, of course, we always got a professional service from the guards when we went to them and used their interviewers. So it's not a reason that we got our own staff trained. It was not because of what the service was being provided, but because we're aiming to increase our own independence. And of course, professionalism and the standard of response to victims by having a unit that deals primarily with victims of domestic or sexual violence or coercive control, to develop a specialty in that area. So the unit, we asked for volunteers because not everyone wants to work in this area, and even those that do, there's probably a limit to what they can tolerate in dealing with this kind of work. But it's aimed at improving our response, conducting effective investigations, and being able to properly risk assess for victims, and also to direct them to the appropriate support services to assist them and help them to get to a better place, and go through the investigative process with us. So it's a response that we need to get right. You need to get it right the first time, because otherwise you may sphere of the behaviour of the perpetrator. As part of the specialist interviewing, we're just about to commission our own interviewing suite in our Dublin office. So we have the latest setup in terms of cameras, monitoring room, and creating an environment there where a young person or a vulnerable person feels comfortable in speaking about what's happened to them. We're also looking to develop a suite in our Cork office as well. So that should be up and running by the end of the summer. So that provides us with some great facilities, and having those facilities in-house, of course, means that there's the reduced delay in terms of trying to book a guard suite, and it means that people who've complained to us come to our office, and the interviews are conducted there. So it's far better from that sort of perception of independence. Maria and I are also about to move into a dedicated office space in our Dublin office as well. So it's part of the investigations area, but it's separate, which means that sort of we have that degree of privacy in discussing cases, or when victims are being spoken to over the phone. And we're also able to lock down cases on our case management system, which may be sensitive. So there's an increased level of confidentiality there for victims. So in terms of training, and some of the work that we've been doing over the last few months, well, both Maria and I have done the Madeline's course through TUS. We're actively engaging with Kuhn. We have actions under the Zero Tolerance Implementation Plan. So we're part of that and engaging with them. And obviously there's other forums, this forum, for example, and other initiatives and conferences such as third level institutions, as they attempt to tackle sort of gender-based violence on their campuses. We use online police training providers. Mainly they're based in the UK, but they're very good for, obviously the legislation is different, but from an investigative perspective, we find that they're very useful and provide us with good information. We're doing work with Women's Aid in terms of risk assessment, responding to the needs of the victim, and safety planning as well. And that particular focus, of course, is around us police as perpetrators. So that's a particular aspect of our work, which I think is quite unique in terms of across the rest of the community. So we have 2 sessions with Women's Aid coming up. We have presentations from the Rape Crisis Centre, because they're obviously a great service that we can link in victims to provide them with support. And also the executive in Fiosrú are very strong on trauma-informed practice. So everyone in the organisation will undertake some level of training in trauma-informed practice. And I know I did a couple of days, a session that was organised by the court service, and I found that very, very useful. It was a very good training. Safe Lives UK is another one, Victims Helpline, and of course recently there was the Garda Inspectorate report, which was published in relation to the experiences of victims of domestic abuse when they engaged with An Garda Síochána. So there were some 50 odd recommendations out of that. I'm still working my way through that, but really it's an excellent piece of work in terms of where we're at, to look at some of the experiences of victims and make sure that we don't make the same mistake where they feel things went wrong, and also to provide that positive service where things went right. So, that's in terms of timing is fantastic for what has come out of that. We're also very conscious of the welfare of our own officers who are dealing with this kind of work. As I said, there's probably a limit to the time people can spend in the unit. And I certainly attended a seminar recently in Liverpool. It's James Moore University, in terms of how police forces look after their officers who are dealing with child sexual abuse material. So we don't deal with that. We don't have people qualified in assessing. But in terms of the application of the way that their officers are looked after and their welfare is considered in terms of training and selection there, it can be as applicable to the type of work that we're doing. In terms of things that we've found with the cases that we've taken on, one is the legislation, of course. When someone makes a complaint to us, it comes in and it's assessed for its admissibility. So there's some criteria that it needs to meet. And once it's admitted, then it's designated, and that designation gives us our policing powers to undertake the investigation. So the admissibility process then looks at the information that's been provided. So it's essentially looking back at what's occurred, and it's admitting the complaint on that basis. We know that the likes of coercive control is ongoing behaviour. So once someone has made a complaint to us, something that may subsequently happen is not included in that complaint. So then that victim finds themselves needing to make another complaint, so that those additional incidents then could be included as part of the investigation. So one of the difficulties is if something happens such as damage to their property, or if they find that the perpetrator might be loitering outside their house, that's something that requires a sort of an immediate policing response, and we're not a response agency. So what we found ourselves saying is you need to go and report that to the guards so you can get a response. So that can be confusing for people, not understanding why they've made a complaint to us, and yet we're actually directing them in some circumstances to go back to the guards to have matters looked at, because the guards are in a position to respond. They can seize evidence at the time. They may be able to identify the perpetrator at the time as well. So that can create some difficulty, and that takes some explaining to the victims on why we're doing that, and then how that can fit into their complaint subsequently. So if the guards respond to an incident, they can then refer that to us, and we could take over the investigation. But in terms of the initial response, then we kind of need to direct them back to An Garda Síochána. And of course, I suppose there's the cultural issue in that it's difficult for victims in any incident, in any circumstances, to reach the point of wanting to report what's happening to them. It can be even more difficult where the perpetrator is a police officer. They know the system. Victims can feel that they're not going to be believed. They may be reporting to the perpetrator's colleagues or even their friends. So there's that extra barrier there. And I think that's a cultural issue that we need to work with An Garda Síochána with, in terms of addressing that, and trying to reduce that barrier when someone makes that initial approach. If they do make it to the guards, then that fear can be overcome. There may be circumstances too where if guards respond to a domestic incident and they arrest another guard or member, there are issues around whether or not they may be charged and released, whether they may be kept for the next sitting of the courts. Certainly in Australia, where an officer in Victoria, where an officer is arrested and charged in relation to a domestic incident, normally they could potentially be granted police bail from the station, but that has been now elevated to an assistant commissioner level. So what they've done is they've tried to remove any conflict of interest around officers who may know or be sympathetic or biased towards that person who's been arrested and charged, and removing it from their hands at the station and elevating that decision a fair bit higher. So I've spoken about the reluctance. I think it's that reluctance around reporting a police officer because they know the system, and the way that they present, perpetrators can present to their workplace, to their friends, to their colleagues is far different to the way they can present in their domestic environment. And so being believed is a big obstacle, I think, for victims speaking up. Looking at some of the media reporting in Australia, and they too are looking at educating police officers around investigating coercive control. So there are a number of articles in the news about it over there. But one officer, and a reasonably senior officer in New South Wales, who was charged with a domestic violence offence and then suspended. He was given a send-off party by his colleagues, and they posted that on social media to intimidate the victim. So, again, that comes back to culture and education, and all that does is add to the fear of victims to report a police officer for that sort of behaviour. And again, if guards were responding to a domestic incident and they did arrest an officer, and there needed to be a decision around charge and release, or the implementation of bail conditions, how that's done. The suspension is a matter for the Garda Commissioner. It's not a matter for Fiosrú. So that's a consideration that the guards need to look at once a member has been charged. And then, of course, bail conditions. If they're charged and released from the station, there's no conditions around that. So should there be a policy around keeping them for court and aiming to get some conditions applied by a judge? And that may take the pressure off the victim then racing to court to try and get some sort of protection order, knowing that the perpetrator's been released. So that's kind of where I'm at. There's some of the issues that we've come across in the few cases that we've done. There's probably some work to do with Garda Corner as we develop in this area as well. As I said, around culture. The guards have introduced their risk assessment tool. Should we be using the same one so that there's a common platform when a risk assessment is done for a victim? Because, like bail conditions, deciding on risk for a victim and any sort of response, again, is going to fall back on Garda Corner. So if we're using a common risk assessment tool, does that make it easier then for the communication between the two organisations when it comes to passing that information on from one to the other? So there's a lot to think about. It's a complex area, but as I said at the beginning, our aim is to get better in this area, to provide the appropriate response to victims, and being part of this community and other groups and forums to try and educate ourselves and improve our service to the victims. So that's kind of me.
Jane, that's brilliant. I see there's a few questions coming in on the chat.